what's going right, what's going
Mm,
well, what's working. And so sometimes, especially when we ride the big waves that are very common in early grief, although the waves will be there for the rest of our life, people can find themselves saying, I can't believe I'm here again. I'm just as distraught today as I
mm,
was
mm,
1 month
mm.
ago, 3 months ago. And the tool that I invite people to use all the time is to be what I call a joy detective, or if joy feels too out of reach, it can be being an ease detective or something.
Right.
But that we have to practice the musculature, I'm going to date myself here, of like taking a Polaroid.
Yeah. Polaroids are back in, Lisa.
Okay,
It's
are they
okay.
back in? Okay. Right.
My
Taking
daughter
a
has one.
taking a snapshot of all the moments of ease, the little delights, the joys, the day that you had where you were looking forward to something for the first time. Anything.
Mhm,
Not
mhm.
as a way to bypass again or toxic positivity your way out of the pain, because that pain is true too.
I'm Art Blanchford, and this is Life in Transition. Welcome back to Life in Transition podcast. I'm really excited to have with us today Lisa Keefauver, who is holder of spaces, holding space and bearing witness. And she is a grief activist, widow, mom, social worker, and author. So, Lisa, I'm very excited to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today on Life in Transition.
Oh, thanks so much, Art. I am so looking forward to this conversation. We share a passion for deep thinking and how we move forward, and I think it's going to be beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. What would you consider, Lisa, to be the word that's coming to me right now is the most meaningful transition that you've been through in your life?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? By the time you make it to 53, it's sort of like, which thing do I pick?
Didn't
I
realize you and I are exactly the same age too. Next
exactly.
month. Next month, I'm 53.
Go Gen X, right?
That's right.
I mean, we love all of you, all the different eras, but
Absolutely.
I think without a doubt, it was both the love and the loss of my husband, Eric, which happened when I was 40 and in 2011. I've certainly survived many other profound losses and traumas in my life, all the way up through as recent as last year. But I think when I think about the personal and professional impact of Eric's death, that is probably the most meaningful,
Mm,
and I've made the most meaning in life out of that transitional time. So,
mm,
yeah.
mm. That was the source of your book as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the work that I do in general as a grief activist, the book is not a memoir. It's a how-to guide, a companion
Right.
guide for grievers. But certainly the fact that I have become a grief activist and specializing in grief, even though I was a social worker when I fell in love when my husband died, and which meant I was working with humans, which meant I was working with grief. I was
For
not
sure.
specializing in grief. And that was part of the issue that I have and why I'm an activist in this work. But so his death, absolutely. And then the death of my friend Joe just a few years later, who I was also
Mm,
with when he passed, both of those things sort of
mm.
put me on that trajectory to being an advocate and being on a mission to change the narratives of grief for sure. Yeah.
And if I remember right, Lisa, too, you have a daughter as well
I
from
do. I
Eric. And how
do.
old was she when
So she
Eric
was
died?
only 7 when Eric died,
Oh,
and Eric died of a massive brain tumor, and after navigating a health system for a year without getting any testing, means he became a completely different person for anybody listening who's known someone who's had a brain tumor, but we didn't understand why. And so when I think
mm,
about the losses that we both face, Eric died in 2011, but we lost him in 2010.
right.
And so
And
in a
that's
way, she was only 6
And it's almost
when
extra hard too because both of you get to experience trying to
yeah.
love and take care of somebody that's not the same person they were
Yeah,
before,
absolutely. And I
right?
think for us, and there's no comparing because all losses are hard. So I'm not here to be a grief
Right.
thief at all. What I call a grief thief is I think what was particularly problematic for us was that unlike somebody who has a family member who has a diagnosis and then watches them become differently, again, like probably many of your listeners know somebody in their life with Alzheimer's or dementia, we knew he was different, but none of us knew why because
Right.
doctors were saying, oh, it's just a mental health issue. Go on this med, go off this med, changes. So none of us
Wow.
understood. Not that understanding would have made it easy, but we
It
didn't understand. And his behavioral changes were radical
Yeah.
and personality changes and sometimes dangerous. So
Yeah.
honestly, we spent the last year of our life trying to keep myself and
Mm.
my daughter and him safe.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. That's tough. And I know you said it doesn't matter. I think it does matter. And not understanding why makes it much more difficult because it's easy to think that it's easy to question the motive a little
Yeah.
bit more than
Yeah.
if you know someone has Tourette's,
Yeah.
you don't have any
Exactly.
judgment. But if you think they're just cussing at you, then they're just an asshole, then they're just an asshole, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean,
It is
there was
different, right?
It was, and when I think later on about the grief I experienced, it really took me years into my own grieving journey to really recognize that there was a piece of my grief I hadn't attended to, which was the ambiguous loss of losing him before I lost him.
Oh,
You know
right.
what I mean? Which is a
Right.
different kind of
Yes.
grief than the sort of finality of the death of somebody. I was with Eric when he died in my arms, and then at the memorial service there, that was horrific, and I never wish that on anybody, but that was a different kind of ending that had a particular kind of social construction around it, meaning
Right.
people knew how to show up for that, and also I had sort of ritual and ceremony, and that loss that I experienced of losing him the year before, like so many losses people experience, was so ambiguous, which ambiguity is inherently more problematic for us humans who are storytelling creatures, and
Yeah.
our
And it's
story didn't make sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's difficult to grieve it properly when you don't know what it is,
Yeah.
and you don't,
Yeah.
when there's no societal norm of definition of
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
And we didn't know why, if it was temporary, what was happening. And so anyhow, that all of that loss, yeah, was just profoundly, and then being required to return to work 2 weeks later was what got me on a path of understanding the cultural problematic stories of grief, my own lived experiences of loss, the way it made me reshape and see my clients. And anyways, I might be getting ahead of ourselves, but that was sort of that path. Yeah.
What I'm interested in returning to work 2 weeks later, I mean, how
Yeah.
do you function? How I mean
I look back and I really still to this day don't know how I functioned. He died on August 16th, and, my daughter was about to return to school, 3rd grade,
yeah, like a week
3rd
later or
grade,
something?
a week or 2 later. We were living in Michigan at the time, and I was the clinical director of a major nonprofit, so we had students coming back on board that I was the supervisor of. I supervised all the clinical staff, plus I had my own client caseload. I'd only been off for about 2 weeks because it was 2 weeks between diagnosis and him dying in my arms.
So, when you said it really was last minute, holy
So
cow.
they finally ran us. I'm gonna get to the returning to work and how I function, because I think it's important for so many of us who live in a culture where if you're lucky, you get a paid bereavement leave of 2 weeks, if you're lucky. But yeah, so a year into the complete behavioral changes and going from doctors to doctors, they finally ran a brain scan. And July 29th, he called me into the AR because they had called him into the AR, and we both looked up on the wall, and there was his brain, grapefruit
Oh,
size
good.
brain tumor that had shifted his brainstem, and the neuro ICU neurosurgeon said, "I don't know how you're walking or talking. This seems like an impossibility." And after a series of inpatient neuro ICU, then sending us home on meds, thankfully having the talk about what he wants to happen in case something goes wrong, because after a 14-hour surgery and saying hello to him post-op, he slipped into what turned out to be his final coma,
Mm,
and more
mm,
surgeries later, he ended up having a series of catastrophic strokes across all of his brain. And so that was 2 weeks that I was off work from the day that I got called into the ER till the day he died. Well, 2.5 weeks. And then 2 weeks later, less than 2 weeks later, my bosses, who were social workers, the head of the
right, right.
nonprofit, called me and said some senior staff had left in that time, weirdly, just coincidentally, because life be lifing. And
Mhm.
we had all these students coming, graduate students coming back on board, and the staff in disarray. And they said, please, we need you to come in. And I mean, they even said, like, even if you like hide in your office most of the time, like, we just need your presence. We need you to be able to onboard our students, the staff. And yeah, I don't know how I function, to be honest. I think for like many people, I went into overdrive and overload. I had to be a parent also. So
Right,
I
as
had to
well.
like get my daughter to school and go explain to the teachers what's happening. And I think, like so many people, I was just in shock. And shock gets a bad rap, but shock helps us not have to absorb
It
everything
has
too
a
fast. It
purpose,
has a
right?
purpose.
Yeah.
And I think I was in shock. I think I'm a high functioning person, not as a brag, but having survived some traumas in my teen, I've learned how to be kind of like dissociate from my body, which I think I honestly did. Not a good thing. I'm not proud of it, but sort of did, and was able to just compartmentalize and keep it together for the most part. Not that you wouldn't have find me in my car or the bathroom in tears some
Sure.
days for sure, but it was problematic. But that was my first sort of inkling of like, even in the social work profession, even as a clinical director, the friends who I love, my friends were amazing, and my colleagues did not understand the cognitive, physical, emotional, spiritual, relational impact of grief. They just
Mhm.
didn't. And I hadn't either. And it wasn't until I walked that through and had to show back up at work that I started to recognize how problematic our grief story was, how that caused so much unnecessary harm to me, to the clients that I serve, how it's reflected in the systems that we have where we don't have paid bereavement leave, especially if like this was my husband, but if it had been my cousin or my aunt or a friend,
Right. Right.
0
0. Yeah.
days. And you'll know this when, I mean, you've maybe experienced loss, and I'm sure so many of your listeners too. You just find a way to function.
And I'm curious about that. And now that you've specialized in this and you have some expertise in
Yeah.
grief now, I had a friend that lost a son, 19 years old, to a distracted driver accident.
Yeah.
And he was back functioning full speed the next day. And of course, he hadn't grieved yet.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like from your expertise now, if
Yeah.
somebody's in that type of situation, is it better to keep the machine moving
You know.
or not? Right? Is it better like
Yeah.
of course it's not processing grief necessarily if you're keeping the machine going, but is it better to sort of be in shock and do the things you need to do without paying
Yeah.
attention for a little while and then let it come out piece by piece? Or is it better to take a whole bunch of time off and have counseling and really let it sink in? What's your experience and your expertise say to that now?
Yeah. I'm going to give you an answer that I give you a lot for people who know me from my podcast or my book is both and.
Hmm.
I think the problematic story is right there that there's some one right way to move forward in our
Ah,
grief.
thank
And
you.
there
Yeah.
is not one right way. And so it really does depend. It depends on who was this. If it was a death loss, by the way, we're grieving non-death losses. But let's
Sure. Yeah.
assume it's a
Absolutely.
death loss.
Yeah.
Who was this person to you? How much of your time, energy, emotional bandwidth, financial impact did this person have in your life? What other resources do you have in your life? What is your own history of loss and trauma and
Right.
attachment?
Is it triggering other things?
Right? Because all new losses will trigger old loss. It doesn't mean we're
Right.
starting from scratch, but this is all a tethered connection. And so I think a couple of things I could offer, because it depends is not a particularly helpful answer, right?
Well, I mean, in
But
first
it is
the first
true.
one
I think
is, but
I
the
think
first one is helpful to say there's not a right or wrong way.
there is
So
not a
whatever
right or
works for
wrong way.
you.
Exactly. And I think so much of the reason we actually struggle and suffer unnecessarily is because we hold ourselves to some story that, well, my friend whose son died went back to work and they're
And
functioning and
therefore
I
I should
couldn't.
do the same
Right.
thing.
We do what I call shoulding all over ourselves, right? With these stories of what grief, quote unquote, should or shouldn't look like. So I think being deeply curious, I think there's a couple of key things is we are not meant to grieve alone. And
Mm,
so whether
mm,
it's a counselor or a grief guide like myself, whether it's a support group, whether it's your friend, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a community, find a community of support. And I
mm.
don't take that lightly because it's hard because we live in a pretty grief illiterate culture. So it's hard
Yeah.
to do that. But I want to name that
And a fairly community illiterate culture as
and a
well,
community
actually.
illiterate culture, right? We know how to grieve intuitively, but our culture has not kept up with what we know to be, which is to gather, to have
Mhm.
ritual, to
Yep. To
express, to
implement. Yep.
metabolize, to implement, and all those things. I do think whether it's work or not, having some structure, and I'm using that word really loosely,
Yes.
right? You don't have to keep doing your chores or signing up for your volunteerism or whatever, but having something to be accountable to be tethered to, whether that is a caring for your kid, whether it's showing up at church, whether it is gardening, I don't care what it is, but having something to be tethered to be accountable to, I think can be really important. If that's work, and also, by the way, the majority of Americans don't have a choice.
Right.
They're gonna
As
lose
well.
their home, they're gonna lose their health insurance, they're gonna lose all kinds of things, right? I mean, part of I went back to work because they asked me, but also now I was a social worker, which you can imagine was not bringing in the big bucks,
But you're
and
the sole breadwinner
but
now
now I'm
too.
the sole breadwinner. So, and we were young, we didn't have a life's retirement or life
Right.
insurance to speak of or anything, which by the way, get it, folks?
Yes, I'll put in a plug for
Yeah,
that too,
yeah,
and life and disability insurance. When you're talking
yes,
about life and transition, those
exactly.
things
Yeah, so
can the lot.
absolutely. So I think find community, find those places where you can process your grief as and when you're ready, because grief is something that's going to walk with us for the rest of our lives if it's a profound loss. And we can talk about what that looks like. And have some grounding, some accountability, some routine, some structure, something to be attending to. And most importantly, as you do that, make sure that you or the people who are asking or offering to show up in support of you, that as you think about the support, you are attending to all 5 domains of your grief, which is not just your emotional support, which is important because grief impacts our emotional well being. And it's not just sad,
Right.
angry and longing and frustration and regret and rumination and remorse, anxiety, etc. But also, how are you or other people supporting you to attend to the cognitive impact of your grief? We have a great researcher thinker of our time who's been on my show, Mary Frances O'Connor, has done research. Our grief is really a chronic stress state. So
Mm,
our
mhm.
brain actually goes very much offline, which can make returning to work difficult because the everyday tasks that used to be very simple to you are really inaccessible. Again, think about you being in that state of running from the saber-toothed tiger. You don't need
Right.
to remember how to process spreadsheets.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Like
This is a
not
dysregulated
this
brain
is a
compared to a
dysregulated
regulated brain.
brain,
Yeah.
right? And then
I
there's
never thought
important.
about that with grief. I experienced that a
Yes,
lot from anger and other things, raising a child with reactive
yes,
attachment disorder.
yes.
But that's with grief too. That makes complete sense
Well,
because you're
because both
really
of
in
those things can trigger a chronic stress state.
absolutely. And it feels life and death.
And it
Right.
feels life and death. It feels very urgent. And so all of this, and which is why the third domain is our physical domain, is impacted by grief. I ended up having to have an emergency root canal 5 days after my husband died because my
Mm,
body was just like, and done.
right.
But the
It couldn't
reason both of
couldn't fight the infections anymore. And it's just
Right?
yeah.
The reasons those things happen, we don't sleep well when we're in the wake of loss. We have digestive issues when we're in the wake of
Sure.
loss. We have oncoming, like reflaring of old chronic or inflammatory issues. We know that there's studies that there increases the risk for some of us for heart failure, blood
Sure.
pressure. Think about that. All what's happening in our body is we are in a fight or flight state. The
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
dangerous quote unquote thing just happened to us, right? Our
Right.
person died.
Right.
And so part of attending to ourself, if you can do that while you're also working, great. And or if you can afford not to work or have that situation, making sure that you're attending to the soothing and bringing back online of your physiological and your cognitive system, which by the way, that's going to last for a time. And then there's the relationships and the spirituality that impacts us.
Before we move on to that, and I
Yeah.
wanna come to that, but how would you recommend, like, what are the tools you would recommend for somebody to bring their body back online, right?
Yeah, yeah. Some of the most simple ones that we underestimate in life in general, but definitely in loss, whatever way you can get sleep, good sleep. If
Super
you've never
important.
been somebody who had to take melatonin or even a trazodone, talk to your doctor, figure out how to get some sleep. I hate to say it, but cut out alcohol. It interrupts your sleep and other
Yeah.
things, right? So I think some basic things like covering your core needs, sleep,
Mhm.
food, nutrition, water, movement, sunlight. Like
Mm.
start there. I think anybody who has really worked on their sleep or their health can know, like, when you're having a bad day, if you didn't have a good night's sleep, your bad day is times 1,000,
That's
right?
right.
The
Yeah.
same goes for rest because again, we have a dysregulated nervous system, which means
Right.
instead of starting, if this is our window of tolerance, if instead of starting from baseline, we're starting from
You're almost at the top.
to the
Yeah,
top, and then there's
9 out of
only
10.
right, or for some of us, we're starting low, and our only places to go is into a extreme because fight or flight is not our only reaction to stress. Sometimes it's freeze or fawn, not to
Freeze.
get to
Yeah.
right to
Yeah.
so I think there's those basic things. I would say the number one to attend to your regulation, human connection and contact, whether it's physical hugs and
Mhm.
touch, but also
Mhm.
being seen, eye gaze, cannot underestimate the importance of
Mm.
bringing us down. Think about when, again, we ran from the saber-toothed tiger, we went into the cave and we were embraced by our people, and
Right.
that's what helped us
Right.
regulate. So having touch, caring touch can be important, which is hard. I mean, one
Yeah.
of the best things one of my best friends did for me was she would come over to my house and just sit on the couch. We didn't have to talk about anything, watch junk TV and cry, but it was just having another human, like having her shoulder to my shoulder was a game changer. I'd say the last thing I want to offer for regulation, because I think it's been the single number one game changer, both in my own grief and loss, but how I show up and work with other people over time, is mindfulness.
Mm.
Mindfulness
Mhm.
practice. It can look like a meditation, yes, but mindfulness and breathing, anything that allows you to keep returning over and over again to the present moment, to using breath and awareness to down regulate any way in which you're feeling. And by the way, I'm using all these terms. It just means when you're feeling overwhelmed or
Yep.
stuck or
Yep.
anxious, which means you're living in the future, or ruminating, which means you're living in the past. Any mindfulness practice, which just is non judgmental awareness of the present moment, is a way to bring that overwhelm down or to lift you from that stuck place. I give talks where I open with a guided meditation. My one-on-one work with people starts with an arriving meditation.
Absolutely.
It's free and available 24 hours too.
Yeah.
That's the best part of it too.
And specifically, I mean, I think if you do the deep in breath and a slower out breath, then
Exactly.
you
Yes.
bring your nervous system down. That's I mean, just 3 breaths makes a measurable impact
Yeah, there's a couple, there
on
are
your
3
nervous
simple
system.
ones. There's like the extended exhale, which is a count of 3 in, 6 count out. You could do box breathing, which is just 4 breathing holds, 4 exhale, 4 hold, 4, or even the science is around the double inhale and an exhale. So breathe in as
Mhm.
deep as you can, then try to take one more sip of air
Right,
and then do a long sigh out. Even 3 of those, I think, have shown through research to calm our nervous system. So
right,
even those things, again, of all the things I mentioned right there, were all free and available to
right.
us.
Right, and I guess the thing that's interesting is that it's not any different than stuff that's good for us on everyday life, but it's probably much harder to access
Yes.
when you also are dysregulated, when you have this massive
Yes.
grief. You don't maybe you don't wanna see anybody, you don't want anyone
Yes.
to see you,
Yeah.
right? But that's maybe what you need, right?
Exactly. I mean, for
Um,
most of us, I think we cultivate these tools in those moments of pressure and stress. I certainly had a meditation practice before this, not quite as deep as I had in post, but I keep this practice up over the years and it has shown up over and over again when my friend Joe died, a year and a half ago when I got diagnosed with cancer and went through that
mhm,
journey. Just like anything, the more we practice it, the more it becomes a muscle memory for us and the easier it is to access. So it's going to feel awkward in the beginning. I would say, just like grief, there's no one right way to meditate. So don't
right.
get caught up in the idea that, it's you can if you can't sit for a 45-minute transcendental meditation, you're fine.
Yeah,
Try
yeah,
doing 3 rounds of breathing in and breathing out longer than you
yeah,
breathe in. If you did that, that
yeah.
was a mindfulness practice.
Yeah, that's a good start. No, that's for sure. Yeah, I have my meditation is all over the place. I do it every day, twice every
Yes.
day, but
Yeah.
it's all kinds of different apps or alone or
Yeah.
while I'm running or while
Yep.
I'm walking, like you said, there's all kinds of ways to do it.
Yeah.
This episode of the Life in Transition podcast is brought to you by Midlife Transition Mastery. If you have reached midlife and you are successful, you have checked all the boxes, you've done everything you thought you should do, and especially pleasing everybody else, doing what you think everyone else needs you to do, but you still feel like something's missing, like you're coming up empty, feeling alone, feeling misguided or lost. Midlife Transition Mastery Explorer community is for you. Here we will build authentic community. We will learn about the 8 steps to mastering midlife transition, and we will learn and execute living life with no regrets in our second half. Please check out the community on lifeintransition.online/MLTM, Midlife Transition Mastery. And I look forward to seeing you around the fire in this community. If you look back to your younger self now, when you
Yeah.
lost Eric and you were forced into this really tough transition, what would you tell yourself now? Like, what would you
Yeah.
like that younger Lisa to know
Yeah.
if you could have visited you then?
Oh, many things. It's gonna be hard to pick a few. I think what my instinct is, and I would just wanna name it out loud that I'm doing it, is I felt very called to place my hand over my heart
Like right now,
right now,
so you
but I
can
just
get in
wanted
touch
to
with
name
yourself.
that,
Yeah, yeah,
and to name
absolutely.
that for all of us is like this gesture of care, even when it's a self-touch, is so profoundly important. And it also is an indication of self-compassion, which is the thing that I think I would offer most
Mhm,
to 40-year-old
mhm.
me who was not only grappling with the death of her husband, but trying to figure out what went wrong in the previous year and what I could have done differently. And if I could have yelled
Right.
more at
Oh, wow.
doctors and
Right.
all the things that went unsaid between Eric and I and went said that I wish hadn't been said. I think I would let that version of me know that starting with, "You're gonna be okay,"
Mhm.
and that
Which is
you're
something we can all and exactly have how you have your hand on your heart,
yeah,
right? To that we can do that in any stressful situation.
it's
To
a
to tell ourselves, "Hey, it's gonna be okay."
I
Right?
do this all the time. I had a meditation teacher once who was amazing, Geeta, and she used to say to me when I would think about like how did I get here? How was this struggle happening? And she would just invite me to say to hand on heart and say to myself, "Of course it is, sweetie. How can it be any other way?"
Mhm.
Right? So I think I would talk to that version of myself first with this loving self-compassion, it's gonna be okay, and second, to let me know that I will find my way forward and that I don't have to know how I'm gonna do it.
Mm.
Because
Mm.
especially as
Mm.
I am returning to work, I'm a clinical social worker, I'm a therapist, I'm a director of people. I should know how to do this.
Mm.
And I think I suffered so much unnecessarily because I believed that A, there was one right way to do it.
Mhm.
B, that if anybody should know how to do it, I should know how to do it because here I am a clinical social worker. And C, that I had to have all the answers right up front.
Mhm.
So I think I would want, like, you're going to fall down, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to do things that are less helpful than other things, and that's going to be okay too.
Right.
And I
But
think
the
there's,
fact is that
yeah.
you are gonna be okay, and you don't have to know how right now
You don't have
that
to
it's
know
all gonna work
now.
out.
Yeah, and one of the things I discovered, I think after Eric passed, but poet David White, I don't know if you know him, I just
Yes, I
love
have
his
listened.
work, and one of his poems, which I actually included in my book, and it's the chapter title of one of my books, which was The Invitation to Start Close In, right? And I think if I had just to final wrap up that question of what would I say to version of me, that 40-year-old, for every trauma that I've encountered, is when I feel overwhelmed, which you will when you are in a state of transition, regardless, whether it's something as
Mhm.
catastrophic as a death or a change in careers or a marriage or whatever it is start with what you know and start close in, which might just be I'm figuring out how to sleep today and to take a couple of breaths.
Right.
And that anytime I coined this phrase early on, because I noticed when I was struggling, which I did a lot in early grief, was when I was visiting horizon time. I
What's
was
that?
Horizon time is that far off place when we are anxiously trying to figure out how is it going to
Oh,
be
we're
okay and
trying to
when are we
predict
going to.
5 years from now or 10 years from now how it's
Yeah,
gonna be.
sometimes positively, but sometimes negatively, but either
Sure,
way,
but either way, it's yeah, we can't
straddling to
control
that
and
place,
yeah.
and then we feel overwhelmed because we don't know how we're gonna get from this broken place to that place.
Right.
And I still have this practice with myself today. 13 years. It's been 13 years since my husband died. I'm a few months out of cancer treatment. I've certainly used this all the time. I've had family members go through major crisis over the last couple of years. It doesn't make the suffering go away, meaning like it just, as I say, my TED Talks title was knowing more about grief can make it suck less.
Right,
And
right. It
my
doesn't make it not
invitation,
suck, yeah.
it doesn't make it not suck, but my invitation is to practice, and this is why mindfulness is so important. And I'm just speaking from what I do for myself. This isn't theory, and how I support my clients is when you are feeling stuck or suffering in some way or overwhelmed in some way, take an inward glance to see if you're spending your time on horizon time. How am I going
Mhm,
to send my kid to college? How am I going
mhm,
to, whatever
mhm,
that thing is? And then gently usher yourself like you would a puppy that has wandered off to this moment and then start close in. Okay, but what can I do today? Maybe even taking inventory of what's okay today or what's
mhm,
easier today than it was yesterday.
mhm.
And then was there one thing I can do? And some days early on, that one thing you can do is phone a friend, take a
Yeah,
breath, take a
absolutely,
nap, whatever it
absolutely.
is. But start close in is the invitation. I wish I would have known I didn't have to have it figured all out, that there wasn't one right way. And that all I had to do, literally as cliche as it sounds, is one baby step in front of the next. That's it.
Right.
That's it.
No, I love that. I love that picture of Horizon Time. I spend a lot of time there, Horizon
We
Time,
do.
and it doesn't benefit, right?
No.
It's
Yeah.
focusing on circle of concern. That's not a circle of control or influence, quite frankly, because we don't know how
Yes.
it's gonna be
Yeah.
5 or 10 years from now.
And we're
Um,
human, which means we're storytellers. That's the very nature. So we're gonna visit horizon time. The goal is not to visit it, it's just not to linger there.
yeah, not to stay there. Yeah,
Because
and
horizon
direct
time also helps us figure out what are our goals? How do we wanna
yeah,
be spending our
sure.
time? So, like, it can be useful, it's just most of us live there a little bit
Yeah.
more than is helpful.
And even with her, I mean, even with setting goals and so forth, I love this quote. I have this 8 steps to mastering midlife transition. I have a group that goes through that, and
Yeah.
I love this quote I have in there from Eisenhower. It says, "Because plan is one of the steps for mastering transition is planning." But Eisenhower says plans are everything, but plan,
Yeah.
right? So to go through the process, yeah, to visit Horizon Time, to go through the process
Yes.
of imaging of where I'd like to be and what do I think the landscape's going to look like, but not be stuck to that because the fact is we don't know what's going to happen once we hit the battlefield at
Exactly, and I
all.
will say too,
Um,
in particular in early grief, which can be months, if not years, often when we're visiting horizon time, it's not the happy, planning, beautiful place. Often when we're
mm,
visiting horizon time, it's we're alone, we're struggling, we don't know how to raise our children, whatever is that negative thing, and so it's particularly not helpful because it doesn't empower us to check in with our own agency.
yeah.
Whether it's traumatic or not, when we experience a profound loss, it's something that happened to us, which means it robbed us of a sense of our own agency. And
Mm,
agency is
mm,
critical to our existence as human beings and
yeah,
especially to our resilience, right? Agency is a key
yep,
component to resilience. And so part of coming back to starting close in, besides sort of reducing overwhelm, it's giving us an opportunity to connect with our own agency. And each
Absolutely.
time we make a choice to take a nap or reach out to phone a friend or we do something that helps things suck less or maybe even helps things feel better, we're enacting our own sort of muscle memory of our own agency so that
Yeah.
next time we've hit a pitfall, whether it's related to this loss or not, we can rely on that memory, that embodied experience of, oh, I've been to a similar place before and I know I'm capable of doing something
Right.
to move
Right.
myself forward. Again, not to like toxic positivity our way out of this, but
No,
just to
but
one step
this
at
is
a
what you're
time.
saying, starting close in
Yeah.
and then practicing the agency. I was listening to, I don't remember the guy's name now, but he's
Yeah.
talking about time management, but the fallacy of time management. But the
Yes.
thing that
Yeah.
he said that I thought was so great was exactly what you're talking about. Is he said, instead of having a to-do list, which
Yeah.
you're starting in a deficit whenever
Yes.
you have a to-do list,
Yes.
at the end of the day, have a done list.
Yeah.
Right? So you're starting from 0 instead of a
Yes.
deficit. Anything you do is positive. And he said, and if you're in a low space, maybe your done list was got out of bed,
Yeah.
got myself
Right?
a cup of coffee, took a shower,
Yeah.
right? And if you're in grief in that space, then maybe those are the things. But that's another maybe tool I would put on there too, is to look at
Absolutely.
what did you do today? And I've been using that. I just heard that maybe 10 days ago.
Yeah.
And I've been using that because I'm a sort of compulsive type A type. And
Yeah.
I always feel like I didn't get enough done. Like
Right.
when I
Right.
do a daily inventory, I had to change my rules of what was the glitch for the day to not calling it something I didn't get done because there's always stuff I didn't get done. But when I started to just look openly at what I did do, I
Yeah.
spent an hour and a half on the phone with my 20-year-old son today.
Yeah.
Wouldn't change that for the world. And
Exactly.
so what that I didn't get other stuff done, right?
Exactly.
So to look at that done list, and it can be something very basic or very simple as well, that can give us again that sense of agency, the sense of empowerment that we did do something today.
Yeah.
We took care of ourselves in these ways, right?
I want to name something just quickly on that specific to grief that I think could be really helpful to your listeners that again I employ with myself and I employ with the folks that I
Yeah,
work with, which is especially in early grief, it's related to the to do is we have a negativity bias. This is our nature as humans, right? We're always
right.
looking out for danger. It keeps us safe.
Amygdala.
Yes, but sometimes it can be an overdrive, especially after we've experienced a profound loss. So
Yeah,
that muscle doesn't need to be exercised. The muscle we do need to exercise is looking out for what's going right, what's going
mhm,
well, what's working. And so sometimes, especially when we ride the big waves that are very common in early grief, although the waves will be there for the rest of our life, people can find themselves saying, I can't believe I'm here again. I'm just as distraught today
mm,
as I was
mm,
1 month
mm,
ago, 3 months ago. And the tool that I invite people to use all the time is to be what I call a joy detective, or if joy feels too out of reach, it can be being an ease detective or something.
right.
But that we have to practice the musculature. I'm going to date myself here of like taking a Polaroid.
Yeah. Polaroids are back in, Lisa,
Okay,
it's
are they
okay.
back in? Okay. Right,
My daughter has one.
taking a snapshot of all the moments of ease, the little delights, the joys, the day that you had where you were looking forward to something for the first time, anything,
Mhm,
not
mhm.
as a way to bypass again or toxic positivity your way out of the pain, because that pain is true too.
Absolutely,
And we can hold both grief and
absolutely.
joy. And the more we give ourselves permission and acknowledge that we have these moments, we are building our own capacity to bear the weight or navigate that next wave when it happens, because we buoyed ourselves with this and because we're now telling a story that a future can look like both things.
Right.
But it takes again a practice because we're designed neurobiologically, especially after this hard thing, to be looking for what's going
Yeah, to
wrong.
catch the negative, what's gonna kill us next, right?
And so
That's
we
the
have to like
survival.
enact, and this requires mindfulness, which is why mindfulness is so important. We have to take a snapshot or enact being aware of what's going well, not just for the fact that it's going well, so that we're not telling this narrative of I'm stuck here, I'm always going to be stuck here, which is a really easy narrative to tell in early grief, but also because it's a clue, speaking of detectives, to say, well, what were the environments or the circumstances such that I was able to have a day or two of ease? Let me take an inventory. I was spending time with people that mattered. I was getting a
Absolutely.
good night's
Yeah,
sleep. I was,
yeah,
and maybe you're not always going to be able to draw the line A to B, but you can get curious so that you can put yourself in the way of that more often in the future and allow that, because those moments of ease or love or connection are going to be the thing that allows us to carry the weight of grief, because we will carry grief with us. We are never going to
right,
set it down. We
right.
just get stronger at carrying it over time.
And that also reinforces what you said earlier about agency. Like,
Yes.
if you look at, okay, what are the patterns here? Just not even if you do anything with it, just the finding of the pattern.
Yes,
Gives yourself a
exactly.
sense of agency, a sense of empowerment.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ellen Langor, you may be familiar with in the work that you do at Ellen Langor is this amazing geriatric studying professor at Harvard. She's in her late 70s now. I was on a call with her recently, but read her books years ago. But she was talking about this time about how people with chronic pain or chronic disease, like really intense,
Yeah.
more effective than any other medicine, is just exactly what you said. Identifying in just, set a watch for an hour.
Yeah.
And in the last hour, was my pain better or worse?
Yeah.
If it was better, what was going on in that hour that it was better? And she said, we have no idea whether it's 100% placebo effect or whether people's things actually affect it other than placebo effect,
Yeah.
but their pain decreases more than any other treatment
It's
when they practice
really
that.
powerful. I mean, again, it's not that there aren't real external circumstances that cause us emotional, physical, psychological pain. And what we focus on amplifies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's why, I mean, I'm not saying necessarily manifest your way into thing, but I am saying if we tune into a certain thing, like moments of ease or feeling well, we're much more likely to notice those later on.
Right.
And that's why things come to us, or that's why we're able to move forward in ways and decrease sometimes our suffering, is because we're on the lookout for it. Will we
Right.
have our days where we're laid low by grief? You better believe it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you might have
Absolutely.
weeks.
Yeah.
And it's important to notice the minutes sometimes, which is all you get, or the seconds in the early times phases of grief where you're not laid low, or where you find ease, or maybe even find, like my friend Cindy Spiegel calls them, micro joys, right? Like
Right.
anything that's just a little bit. And that's the seeds that you want to keep planting.
This episode of the Life in Transition podcast is brought to you by Transition Mastery Coaching. If you have made it to midlife and you're successful and you are going through transitions in your life, in your business, in your career, or in your organization, and you are looking to master those transitions, to make the most of them, to accelerate into the next phase of your organization or your life. If you're facing challenges in your business, challenges in your relationship, challenges in your health, and you really want to transition those quickly, I'm here to guide you for that. And I look forward to working with you. And you can sign up for either Pinnacle Transition Coaching or Summit. Please go to lifeintransition.online/MLTM and scroll to see the Summit and Pinnacle Coaching, or reach out to me directly on my email, art@artblanchford.com. And I look forward to connecting with you and helping you to accelerate your transitions to achieve what it is that you want to achieve in the second half in your organization and in your life, so you can live your whole life with no regrets. So there's two things I wanted to come back to. One was, you said, and I wanted you to tell a little bit more about this. You said it's okay to hold grief and joy at the same time.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't believe that.
Yeah.
Right. So tell a little bit more about that and your experience with like holding both grief and joy, because if you can't hold joy with the grief, maybe you never give yourself permission to hold joy ever again.
Which can be, I find that in a lot of people. I remember, yes, I want to talk about that. And I think it is a hard concept, but I think for most of us, if we really pause, we know intuitively that there's some truth to that.
Hmm.
I remember the very first time I laughed out loud after my husband died. And I remember laughing out loud. I was watching The Daily Show with Jon Stewart back in the day,
Right.
although I guess Jon Stewart's back around again. All
Yeah.
things come back
Yeah.
around. And I laughed out loud so loud, middle of the night, because I couldn't sleep, was watching it
Right.
on YouTube or whatever, and laughed. And then immediately started crying because I felt so bad. What is wrong with me? I must
Felt
not really have
guilty.
loved my husband. And, like I had a whole narrative. And thankfully, I was on the phone with a friend who would stay up late into the night with me, because he knew that's the time that things were the hardest for me. And he kind of reassured me that it was okay. There's so many emotions that we can hold both at the same time. The complexity, the false culture that we have around binary thinking is so
Yeah.
problematic in life, again, but also
Yes.
particularly in grief. I think Khalil Gibran, or one of these poets, had sort of said, it's like the depths of our capacity for joy mirror the depths of our capacity for grief, and vice versa. I'm
Right.
paraphrasing. That's not
Yeah.
what he said, but I do know to be true. Another phrase you hear often is grief is love. And I actually think it's true when it's around somebody, but we can even grieve people. We can grieve the relationships we didn't get to have, or the love that we
Sure.
didn't get, or
For
the
sure.
dreams that are deferred. I think the key is that when we're grieving, especially someone we love or something that we've lost, a something or a someone, it is in order to be with that and to honor them and to honor the connection that was lost, we have to be present to the life that we still have. And to be present
Mhm.
to the life that we still have means we must, I think, insist that we open ourselves up to joy and that we can hold both those things. Think about the time, like a notion of bittersweetness, where you're somewhere and I call these opportunities smiling, when you're smiling and crying at the
Right, at
same
the same
time,
time, yeah.
where you're standing in front of something like awe and you're so happy and it's the most joyous. And then you start crying because you think the one person you would want to tell about this
Is not here.
amazing thing is not here. And so you're like joyous and grieving all at the same time. That's a perfect, sometimes it's that clear,
Right.
but other times it's more fluid where we're moving back and forth. I will say another way to think about grief and joy as one pairing, emotional pairing, is that we do not get to have our emotions a la carte,
Mhm.
though we would like to. And
Yep.
so the degree to which we push away our grief, our sorrow, our anger, and our rage is the degree to which we do not allow ourselves to access delight and joy and wonder. And so I think this has been my experience personally and professionally. The people I know who are most capable, you might see in the world as being optimistic or hopeful or who embrace the daily beauty of everything. I mean, I go on beauty walks literally every day.
Right.
Joy and delight and wonder are the people who have turned towards the hardest, most difficult things in their lives because you cannot have one without
That's
the
right.
other.
That's right.
And so I think I get that it's intellectually sort of hard to grasp for us. And if you're listening and you're deep early in grief and you might be thinking, F you, Lisa,
Right.
joy is so far away. And to be honest, if somebody had told me you're going to feel joy again, I would say F you also
Right.
back in the
Right.
day and start close in. And it might not look like joy. It might look like a moment of ease, but to allow ourselves to be open to the human experience. And so that every emotion we've ever had passes.
Right. Yeah, they can just come through and move through
Including
us
the ones, by the way, we want to stay, they don't
that you wanna
stay.
cling to us. No, they don't stay either. That's right.
So to
Yeah.
be present to them all means that we allow them to move, and it's through the moving through of our emotions that we allow ourselves to be present to life, to find meaning in life, to be able to carry our person forward with us, which is what we do in the wake
Yeah.
of loss. But all of that means we have to learn these skills, which most of us never learned, which is how to regulate our emotions, how to allow ourselves to be with our emotions, including those moments or days or seasons where we're holding the both and, for
Right.
instance, the
Right.
grief and the
Yeah.
joy. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanna add one thing to this, and I'm curious your reflection on this as well.
Yeah.
One thing I've noticed was when I am and it's not so much with feeling sadness, but if I'm feeling depression, like this
Yeah.
grayness, this darkness that's almost not really emotion, but it's a block. It's when I'm
Yeah.
resisting something.
Yes.
When I can take a step back, this comes to your mindfulness point, but when I can even change to the third person,
Yes.
instead of using statements like, I am depressed, like that's a
Yeah.
really strong one. That's an
Yeah.
identity
Yeah.
to, oh, look, there's Art feeling some depression again.
Yes. Yes.
Just that step, it's like 2 steps back can make it feel much less overwhelming
A
at that moment to put it in third
100%.
person.
100%. I love that. So my training in graduate school was in narrative therapy. So it was very much around identity and narratives and the stories other culture tells us, but the stories we tell
We tell
ourselves. So
ourselves.
that's an example of what a practice we would use in narrative therapy called externalizing, sort of externalizing the problem. So when we say things like I am, which is an identity statement,
Right.
then we get ourselves stuck there because if that is who we are, then again, back to horizon time, then there's no way forward that is differentiated from that experience. It might seem, if you're listening, like this is just wordsmithing, but words hold profound power, as do the stories that we tell
Absolutely.
ourselves. And
Yep.
so if you say, I used to have clients where I would say to them, I would externalize and imagine that we would have I had a third chair in my office when I saw people live in practice in an office back in the day when we did that and saw people live. And someone would say, I am depressed, right? And I would say, let's look at depression over there in the chair and let's have a conversation. You're in a relationship with depression. Depression has shown up. And just that mindfulness
Yeah.
practice gives us a chance to see a different way forward, to be curious, to be a detective
Mhm.
again. What
Mhm.
are you here
Mhm.
for? What are the circumstances that brought you here? What is it that I'm not attending to? What do I need to learn from you? Are
Right.
you here because you're just practice at being here and I need to take a step in a different direction because that's a muscle that just gets built and you just
Right.
know how to show
Right.
up. So I love that you brought that up. I think it's profoundly powerful. It doesn't mean that we don't get to claim, by the way, our deep feelings.
No, not
So
at
if you
all.
want to
Not at
say,
all.
I am angry,
Yep.
I'm feeling, but
Yeah.
I think it's really important to say, I'm feeling, or
Right.
I'm noticing, I'm experiencing, as
Yeah.
that little shift
Because
gives
we are
us space.
not the feeling. We are
We are not the
having that
feeling.
feeling. 'cause they're
And
having that feeling.
exactly, and then having that distance also allows us to learn from it, but also allows the feeling to move through us, which all feelings are
Right.
want to do. Now, in early grief or in grief in general, some of those feelings are gonna be on
A loop.
a loop. They're gonna be showing
Yeah.
up, visiting you all the time, but if you can have a little distance, then you can allow it to move through so you can have that respite, those moments of ease, build up your capacity for when they visit again because they
They
will
will.
visit again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Lisa. When did you notice that you gave yourself permission to have joy? Not that you
Had it. Yeah.
spontaneous had it, but where you thought it's okay for me to be in joy again.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it didn't happen in one day. I think it happened in little fits and starts.
Mm, mm. Okay, so you
Yeah.
experienced it and then you start to think
Yeah, and I
maybe this is
experienced
okay,
it and
maybe
it
this
was
is
okay.
okay.
Maybe the first time I had a lot of judgment and guilt, and maybe the second time I noticed the story of judgment and guilt, but I didn't really hold on to it. I can remember a time going out dancing. Actually, it's where I met my now best friend who I met about a year after my husband died. And the mutual friend introduced me as, hey, this is the woman whose husband just died, which is just a lovely way to be introduced. But I remember dancing, which is my happy place. I was a dancer when I was young. And that was one of my first sort of full evenings of joy.
And
And
that
it
was
was
about a year later.
yeah, but I had moments of joy, but that's one that comes to mind where it was just sort of an uninhibited kind of time of joy. But I think it's important to come back to what I just said is I don't think it's nothing except in the movies in Hollywood is rarely aha moment. I've now completely shifted my frame
No,
of
for sure.
reference. Right. And we do have those
We'll feel
little
that way in the moment, but then
epiphanies.
we'll go
Yeah.
back to a different one and then we'll come
Because
forward.
again, we have a culture, we have a story that we've embedded in our body, in our mind, in the way we show up in the world. And so we're going to have to kind of tease it apart over time. And so I think I had some of those moments. I think it helped that I had my own therapy practice. I was
Sure.
seeing also somebody at the time. I
Yeah.
had friends who were very kind and reminding me it's okay to smile.
Right.
So
Right.
I think having that connection and that affirmation, but it took like kind of practicing it
Mhm. Mhm.
like anything else, you can't really get good at or be comfortable with unless you practice it. So I think it took in little fits and starts. And I would say probably a year later, I really noticed kind of a bigger sea change in terms of that. But believe, I just want to name too, believe you me, that year, the next year, even 13 years later, I still have days or hours where I'm laid low by grief and the
Oh,
overwhelm and where joy can feel inaccessible. But now I have enough experience and agency, and I've taken enough Polaroids where I know this too shall pass.
right. Yeah,
And
super
all
important
and
to
my only
remember.
job right now is to be present to it, not to cling too
Right.
tightly, but
Right.
not to push away either.
Not resist it either, because that's another way of holding on to it, actually. You're stopping the flow.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. So I always say I grew up in Michigan where we learned how to ski on a tow rope. We had to
Yep.
grab the
Yep.
rope. So it's always I always think of the tow rope metaphor. It's like you don't wanna grab too tight because you're gonna,
Right.
fall flat on your face.
Right.
Sorry, people who grew up in California. Or you don't wanna not grip because you're not gonna move anywhere, and that's another way of
Right.
thinking of resisting. And so, like, how do we just attend enough
Right.
and so that
Move
we
with
can
it.
move with it, and that's how we metabolize grief, that's how we metabolize joy, that's how we learn to build our agency and resiliency so that we show up more present to life, more present to joy, and more aware of our own capacity to navigate that next hard thing because there will be a next hard
That's right.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. 2 more
Yeah,
questions for you.
please.
If you could pull out one thing, and maybe it goes back to mindfulness because you've talked about this a lot already, but if someone's really going through a tough spot in grief right now and feels
Yeah,
at the bottom and feels alone,
yeah,
what's a one tool that you would give them that they can do right now
yeah.
where they're at and to start to make a difference? I can hit pause on what they're listening to and implement right this minute.
Oh, it's so hard to pick one. Yes, mindfulness, I think, is core because it regulates us back down into place of not being in panic. But if we could move beyond some breath or some mindfulness thing, I would say reach out to somebody.
Mm,
Have the courage to reach out to somebody, anybody. We all know we are not meant to do this alone.
absolutely.
It takes so much vulnerability, and I've had to learn this lesson over and over and over again. I had to learn it again in this season of my life going through cancer, is that we all need help sometimes. So I
Mhm.
would say if you feel stuck, even if that person's job is not to show up and fix you, that person's job is to come sit down on the floor and be next to you and
Right.
keep you company while you're there, metaphorically and or literally. I had friends who would come literally when I couldn't get off the floor because I was
Right.
so taken laid low by grief. So I
Yeah.
would say
So
reach
reach out to someone.
out to somebody.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be an expert, although, yeah, great, reach out to that. It just could be a friend. Can you just come sit with me?
Yeah. And if that feels too much, just talk to them on the phone even,
Oh, no, yeah, for sure.
right?
FaceTime, phone,
Yeah,
video, text. It doesn't
yeah.
have to be an in-person thing.
In person is the best, but sometimes that can feel overwhelming too, right?
I mean, I didn't it was a push-pull. I really didn't wanna see people because, first of
Right,
all, I felt like I had pressure to perform because most of the people in my life were also grieving Eric, but I didn't really wanna deal with their grief because it was my
right.
grief. Also, they showed up and said all the stupid things. Not all of my most of my friends didn't, but some people did, like any
Yeah.
sentence that starts with "at least," which just don't start a sentence with "at least." So it is I
That
have a
just hit me. That's horrible.
Never. Don't I
Yeah.
mean, so many people said a version of "at least." Somebody said to me as I was taking my husband off life support in the hospital, "Don't worry, Lisa, he'll be in a better place soon." Yeah. I have an entire chapter in my book called "People Say Stupid S Word." And there's another chapter called "Why Going Places and Seeing People is Exhausting."
Mhm.
In grief, and it is, and so I don't take lightly when I say reach out to somebody. I want you to think through, but part of that reaching out is maybe even to practice naming, "I know there's nothing you can do to fix my
The
pain.
situation,
I
yeah.
just need to be seen or
Yeah,
heard."
yeah.
We can never underestimate, as you introed me, my sustained meditation for more than 2 decades has been on holding space and bearing witness. And ironically, I just had a client right before our conversation today who I've been working with for months. And she said to me today, unsolicited, "I don't hope you don't take this the wrong way, but the most powerful thing that you've taught me a lot of skills and mindfulness, and blah." But she said, "The most important thing that you've done for me is seen me and believed me in my pain."
Absolutely,
I
absolutely.
mean, it makes me want to cry right now. So,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
that's all you need from that person is for
right.
them to just see you as you are,
Yeah.
and that's
And
it.
I think that's a great thing to clarify is that you're not necessarily asking for them to, you let them know, I don't expect you to fix it. I don't expect you to
Yeah,
say the right thing. I just want to be connected. I want someone to see me where I am
yeah,
right now.
yeah. I think it's the most underrated therapeutic value thing that we can do as a professionals or persons in our lives. And by the way, grief is not a sign you're broken, which means it's never your job as the grief supporter to fix the griever.
Right,
And no
right,
one can fix us. It's about being accompanied. And maybe what we're asking for is, can you come help me bear the weight for a little while?
right. No, I think that's beautiful. I've said this a lot recently. I feel like I almost maybe say it on every podcast, but this thing about people love to be seen and not to be
Yeah.
watched.
Exactly. Watch is
Right.
pity.
Yeah,
Watch is
but the
pity.
scene is to acknowledge the like, namaste, right?
Yeah.
The holy in me
Yes.
sees the holy in you.
Because whether
Right.
that person's experienced your loss, they've have or will be in a place of deep pain. That is the human
Absolutely,
experience. And so it says,
absolutely.
because when you're in deep grief, you feel not of this world. You feel
Yeah,
isolated from yourself, isolated from the world. Nothing makes sense. And so to be seen in that visual, physical sense, but also just to be seen, I see you in your brokenness, in your
right.
humanity. I know that to be true because I am a human who has also
Yeah,
experienced brokenness.
and I'm not gonna turn away from it because it's uncomfortable for me. I
Right.
can just be here with you, and I can hold that
Exactly.
space, right?
The most powerful thing we can do for another human being. My
Yeah.
sign off on my own show is I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart. That's how I
Beautiful,
sign off my show because I think that's
beautiful.
at the core what every one of us needs from the other person.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Wow. Now that's a great tool, and thank you for that. I think that's something everybody can use. And then the last thing, Lisa, is where can people find out more about you? Tell us a little bit about your book that you just held
Yeah.
up, and where can they reach out to you on websites or social
Yeah.
media, or how do they connect with you?
Yeah, I would love to talk with people, holding space for people in live events, on virtual, on my show. I'm actually doing a special call-in show where I'm inviting callers to leave a voicemail so I can hear them and then answer
Mm,
their questions live. So my names, you can find me at my name, just as lisakeefauver.com, KeeFauver.com. You can follow me on socials, which is just my name plus the letters MSW, which stands for Masters in Social Work, Lisa Keefauver, MSW. And then my book is available. Grief is a Sneaky Bitch is the name of my book and also the name of my podcast. The podcast is available where this podcast is available
yeah,
on every
everywhere.
platform. And the book is available also everywhere on your I love to encourage people to go to your favorite local independent bookseller because they're my favorite places to hang out. But if you can't, you can order it from your favorite online booksellers. And if you're more of a listener than a reader because you're listening to this podcast, I also narrated my book. So you can download it on Audible as well. But yeah, I
Wonderful.
think the best way to figure out how you might want to work with me or learn from me or listen to me or connect with me is to sign up for my newsletter. So if you go to my website, lisakeefauver.com/newsletter, you can get periodic messages in your inbox. I call it the not so regular newsletter because
Nice.
grief isn't on a schedule and neither is this newsletter.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Lisa, I really appreciate you opening up for us and sharing your experience and
Yeah.
the strength that you've built and tools that we can all use that make it okay to be where we are
Yeah.
and have the agency to take little steps forward.
Yeah. Thank you
Uh,
so much for what you're doing. I loved the conversation so much, and I appreciate the chance to talk about my favorite subject.
oh, thank you. A difficult one. I'm glad somebody's favorite subject so we
I
can all
know.
learn from it.
I know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Take care. I can't wait to hear what action you are taking. Connect with me on LinkedIn or our website, lifeintransition.online, and let me know. Let a friend know too. It could be a huge encouragement to them and keep you on the track. Thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and it would mean a lot to me if you left a review and shared this episode with a friend. If you want to learn more about me and what I do when I'm not podcasting, please visit me at artblanchford.com. Thank you for listening. Together, let's make the most of life in transition.